Hello everybody, welcome to Stonx Music. My name's Ollie and today we're going to be having a look at reverb in this deep dive session. Let's go! Right, so here we are back in the Ableton Manual. Let's jump straight into it. Reverb. Input processing. The input signal passes first through the high and low cut filters, whose XY controller allows changing the band's center frequency, X-axis, and bandwidth, Y-axis. Either filter may be switched off when not needed to save CPU power. Pre-delay controls the delay time in milliseconds before the onset of the first early reflection. This delays the reverberation relative to the input signal. One's impression of the size of a real room depends partly on this delay. Typical values for natural sounds range from 1 millisecond to 25 milliseconds. Early reflections. These are the earliest echoes that you can hear after they bounce off a room's walls, before the onset of the diffused reverberation tail. Their amplitude and distribution give an impression of the room's character. The shape control sculpts the prominence of early reflections as well as their overlap with the diffused sound. With small values, the reflections decay more gradually and the diffused sound occurs sooner, leading to a larger overlap between these components. With large values, the reflections decay more rapidly and the diffused onset occurs later. A higher value can sometimes improve the source's intelligibility, while a lower value may give a smoother decay. Spin applies modulation to the early reflections. The XY control accesses the depth and frequency of these modulations. A large depth tends to provide a less coloured, more spectrally neutral, late diffused response. If the modulation frequency is set too high, Doppler frequency shifting of the source sound will occur, along with surreal panning effects. Spin may be turned off using the associated switch for modest CPU savings. Global settings. The quality chooser controls the trade-off between reverb quality and performance. Eco uses minimal CPU resource, while high delivers the richest reverberation. The size parameter controls the room's volume. At one extreme, a very large size will lend a shifting, diffused delay effect to the reverb. To other extreme, a very small value will give a highly coloured, metallic feel. The stereo image control determines the width of the output stereo image. At the highest setting of 120 degrees, each ear receives a reverberant channel that is independent of the other. This is also a property of the diffusion in real rooms. The lowest setting mixes the output signals to mono. Diffusion network. The diffusion network creates a reverberation tail that follows the early reflections. The decay time control adjusts the time required for this tail to drop to 1/1000th minus 60 decibels of its initial amplitude. High and low shelving filters provide frequency-dependent reverberation decay. The high-frequency decay models the absorption of sound energy due to air, walls, and other materials in the room, people, carpeting, and so forth. The low shelf provides a thinner decay. Each filter may be turned off to save CPU consumption. The freeze control freezes the diffused response of the input sound. When on, the reverberation will sustain almost endlessly. Cut modifies freeze by preventing the input signal from adding to the frozen reverberation. When off, the input signal will contribute to the diffused amplitude. Flat bypasses the high and low shelf filters when freeze is on. If flat is off, the frozen reverberation will lose energy in the attenuated frequency bands, depending on the state of the high and low shelving filters. Echo density and scale parameters provide additional control over the diffusion's density and coarseness. Also, when the room is extremely small, it has a large impact on the coloration contributed to the diffusion. The chorus section adds a little modulation and motion to the diffusion. Like the spin section, you can control the modulation frequency and the amplitude or turn it off. Output. At the reverb output, you can adjust the effect's overall dry-wet mix and vary the amplitude of reflections and diffusion with the reflect and diffuse level controls. Right, so that's reverb. Let's jump into Ableton and see what we can do with it. Right, so here we are back in Ableton. I've started off just by making a little beat so we can have a look at some drums. I'm going to assume that most people kind of know the basics of reverb or have their ways they like to do it, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but this is just some of the basic things that I do. So let's have a listen to this beat first. I've used a lot of very dry sounds. So this snare drum, if we wanted to add a bit of reverb to that, bring a bit of room to it, we'll drag that in. Now you can see mine might look a little different to yours because I've changed my default preset. So I've set quality to high, I've turned high and low cut off, spin off, chorus off, my pre-delay is all the way down, then right click and save as default preset. So the main bits that I really use with the reverb is the dry wet, the decay time and the size. So if you have a look now, we can turn the dry wet all the way up and we're not going to be able to hear any of our initial snare. And this is how I'd have it set if I had it on a return track. So I can right click, insert return track down here, and that's how I would have it set with the dry wet all the way to 100%, and then I'd be sending this off to that reverb. So I won't do that for now, let me turn that off. Instead, let's turn this back down to 50% and we can adjust from there. So we still get our initial. Now that sounds a bit too washy, a bit too washed out for me. So the two things that I'd mess around with is size and decay time. So it sounds like that's in a very big room. Let's bring it down a bit. Or all the way that way. Yeah, that's more of a shushung kind of sound. So that's the bit that's kind of preference, I think, up to you where you really want the coloration of the reverb. Some of theirs kind of nice. So the main one, the main kind of rule I go by with decay time is you don't want the decay time to overlap the next snare sound. So if you have a look here, that's good, it's gone by there. So we could push that all the way up to here before it's going to start muddying up our mix. So that's too much. You can still hear it over the next one. So there is some maths you can do to figure out how long it could be, or you can just do it manually and kind of play it by ear. That's nearly there, a little lower. That's pretty much dead before the next one hits. So I wouldn't go any longer than that in this current sound. So let's have a little listen now and we can adjust the dry wet accordingly. Maybe even less than that, I'll go for 5. So for me, I'm really not a big reverb fan on my drums. I'd be using it at about that 5% just to add a bit more space and room to it. If we did want though, with the return track, so that's my snare reverb. Generally, if I am putting reverb on a snare, that would be tailored just for that snare. So we could have this drum group, and then here, this is where I'd be using the return track. So all of our drums could be sent to this return with dry wet. So we could look in the presets. They've got some good room presets here for you to start with. Big room, backbone, guitar room. So if you have a look at what they think these are, let's go to backbone. So they've got a high cut, a bit of spin on the reflections, a bit of chorus, and then really big size and less on the decay time, and the pre-delay is quite far that way. So like I say, for me, I almost never use any of this input, early reflection or chorus, but let's have a listen and see what this sounds like. There's quite a big pre-delay, so you should be able to still hear the transients coming through from the initial sound. Which is quite good. That's the reason to use that pre-delay. I would go ahead and turn all of these off for me personally. I just don't like the extra sounds it gives. Maybe that high cut was necessary, right? But rather than doing it like that, I prefer to have the control myself, and I'll come in with my span, have a look at what I've actually got going on here, and then do it with separate plugins. So generally, I don't want any of that low end, and I'd probably duck some of that high end. So let's come up here to our auto filter before there, set that at 200. And then I'd probably just bring that down with an EQ8. Turn that one off. Dun, dun. So what's the difference? Let me group these, turn them off and that on. And I just don't like any of that low end in my reverb. I think it muddies up, especially with all my low basses in the mix. So let's have a listen now to this. Turn that down a bit. So that's kind of the standard basics of reverb, how I use it. I'll be using it on particular snare or something, making sure it doesn't overlap the next sound, or in a return track, just to kind of add a bit of dimension to putting your drums in a room. A lot of the stuff I do isn't realistic drums, it's very electronic, so I can afford to be a little more loosey-goosey with this stuff. But pretty much that's how I use conventional reverb. So the next thing, which is a lot of fun with this reverb, and I think a few other reverbs that I've seen recently have this as well, is the freeze button. So let me grab this, Control C, Control V. Actually, let's grab a MIDI channel instead, and we can get operator in like we always do. So let's grab our instruments, operator, drop that in here, and we've got, turn the reverb off for now. Cool. Some nice sound. And let's just go mad for a minute like we always do. Grab an amp. Turn that way. Oh, auto filter. Notch. Here. Resonator up. Some of that movement. Let's grab a flanger. Bit more on that movement. Glue compressor. Get some of those noises, and let's grab something like, let's use our resonator we were using in the last episode. On my on, I'm on a C, that's fine. So we'll go 12 up, minus 12, minus 4, minus 4. We'll go minus 3, plus 3. Cool, it's giving us some movement. Let's grab a max audio effect, get an LFO, and I'll put that on our color. We don't want it all the way down. Cool, something like that. So let's go here. We're going to go Control Shift M, find that C note I was messing with. Boom. Should we want anything else crazy on here after that? Probably don't need it, but go on, let's put a grain delay on after. Cool, so here's our sound. I'm going to hit this freeze button, but I'm going to record, show automation, and we'll turn it on halfway through. So now we're going to have this. You can hear that pad created. So we're going to turn the size right up, decay time right up, wire rate right up. And that's going to go on indefinitely. So we can Control Shift T, nope, I always did that wrong, Control T, get our audio, resample mode, arm it, record it, and here we go. And just by moving the size and the decay time, you can get some of these weird sounds. So here we have, I can rename that C drone. And from here, we could use that for wavetable. We could use that as a pad sound. We could use that as a riser, or we could use it as an intro before this bass sound. So let's come back up to here with this one turned off. Turn that grain delay off. So now if we had this, we could, what's going on at the beginning there? We've got a little weird bit, MA. Let's fade that weird bit out. So we could go here and zoom up, if it's a 4-bar intro for instance, to there, and cut that bit, and now you'd have so it's the same sound. And I say this a lot in other videos, you could go and get a drone from somewhere else, but having all of your sounds kind of coherently made out of the same thing does add a certain kind of coherence to your music, where things don't sound so cut and spliced from different places. So that's a really fun one to use. We could also just use that as a whole long droney pad. We could Control Shift T for a new MIDI and drag that in. We know it's a C, so it should be all right set on C. Right click, simpler sampler, and now we have this kind of droney sound we can use for stuff. Oh, press my M. And it starts with that kind of clippy sound we don't want. We can zoom right in and get it up to where we want. So you've got this really cool sound, and then halfway in the middle here we started moving the size and things, so we get some of these other weird which are kind of weird versions of white noise, but you can tell they're all at different places. So you can do something fun with that. Use them in your snares or anything. Or you could use that as a riser if you wanted or something. So we could just take this first part and we could just loop where it's actually nice. If we wanted to here, and we could bring the loop to like this bit. Hear a weird little click at the beginning where the automation kind of turned on. It's a little bit weird, so maybe if you wanted that cleaner, we could come up to here, reverb on, and where the freeze comes on, we could have that automate in a bit more like this maybe. That just gives you a good place to start off with creating some of your own sounds out of other things. I mean, you could synthesize a drone like this, or you could take one of your basses and make something out of it. Same goes with your kick drums or your snares or anything like that. We could do the same thing. If we were to take this here, Control C, go down to a new track, Control T, drop it in. We could grab this same reverb from here, Control C, into there, Control V. And then let me show the automation, and we'll have that do the same thing here. So we could have a listen. Might want it on first. And this is a quite nice one actually, just for using at the beginning of a track, for instance. If we come here, resample there, turn the reverb back on, we can come here and record. Turn that off, and then we can reverse this, and our kick is going to be on the kick, which is like about there. And you could have this, that off, this here, that there. Let's just solo those two. So it's kind of like fades out of the sound you've already got into your kick. So you could either build an intro out of that or just use this. And if we MA, we can kind of fade this in, fade this out on either edge. So it's just a nice way to kind of create big textured sounds out of the sounds that you've already got. So that's one of the kind of more creative ways of using reverb. It's really fun, just that freeze button. Everything else, there's a lot of people don't actually rate this reverb. They say use an external reverb or Max for Live convolution reverb, which gives you more responses and more things like that you can actually do. But for the basics, this reverb does do everything it needs to do. It gives you a sizable room. It gives you some high and low cut processing, and with the high quality mode it doesn't sound that bad. It's a pretty bog standard reverb. The main thing that you're going to be wanting to set is the size of your room and the decay time of those reverbs. As it said in the manual as well, you can actually change the reflex and diffuse time. I find that they're less useful, but if you want to mess around and kind of create some weird crazy sounds, again, that would be the way I would do it. If we come over here, let's delete you lot, come solo this one. Just kind of get that white noise fizzle out of it. We could layer that back into our snare drum. And let's get rid of this reverb that's here. So rather than thinking of it as reverb, we're kind of using it as a noise generator there to kind of give us that fizzle of the underneath of the snare. And our size, again, we can kind of change that, how that sounds. You want these short times, that kind of metallic-y sound, to drive it up again. And before and after. So it's just giving a nice bit of fizz that you could either do with other sounds or by using white noise or something. You can use reverb for that by messing with the spin and chorus amount and kind of pushing it the way that you wouldn't usually use a reverb. Alright everyone, that'll do it for this episode of Deep Dive. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about reverb. Like I say, it's not the most loved reverb out there. A lot of people say use the Max for Live convolution reverb or any external reverb. A lot of people don't really like the Ableton one, but you can get all the sounds you need with it. You can add some reverb to your drums. You can use that freeze function to create some nice big pads. It does everything it needs. It does what it says on the tin. It's a reverb. So don't forget, project file available down in the description, and leave us a subscribe if you want to see more of this content. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!